added were to the framework. So UNSTI is gaining more visibility within the UN, that's for sure. And we know that it's also gaining visibility outside the UN. As a matter of fact, yesterday when I was at the registration desk, I saw this flyer. It says UNSTI. We really didn't do this. Somebody from the community obviously did it. Thank you for getting our logo out there. Sometimes I think that the outside the UN, there's more enthusiasm about UNSTI than there is inside. The current status is, of course, there's the ongoing work at the agency level. Thematic STIs are already emerging. Engagement at the highest levels of the UN Secretariat is a very important development because without that leadership and championship, it's difficult to get this thing off the ground. We don't have, like within the European context, a directive. UN is obviously a lot of organizations working together, but there's not an overarching governance of the UN as such, with all the specialized agencies and so on and so forth. With the involvement of the Chief Technology Officer and the Assistant Secretary General, we were able to put together the new updated framework and the Center of Excellence for UNSTI project proposal. This is the project proposal that is actually setting up the project to implement the core deliverables. And we're looking for funding for this. Now, of course, the moment you start talking about funding, things get even more political. And that's happened very, very fast within the UN. In April of this year, there was an UNGWIC principals meeting, and three different major decisions were made at that meeting. One of them was the establishment of a working group to rate the current UNSTI framework deliverable proposals, to make them much more cohesive. Second important decision was the provisional endorsement of the establishment of the Center of Excellence for UNSTI under the auspices of the Assistant Secretary General and Chief Information Technology Officer. Now, this is finding an institutional home for the project, which is a very important development. And finally, we said we're going to finalize the terms of reference of these two governance bodies, the Steering Committee and the Technical Advisory Group, and solicit the nominations. What has happened since then, though, is interesting. The UNGWIC's co-chairs have said, hold off on any follow-up action until further notice. And they've done this because one big key player opposed the project proposal for setting up the Center of Excellence. And the co-chairs want to make sure that this is a consensus-based initiative. So they are actually negotiating with all the key players to make sure that this particular decision to set up the project is done in a consensual manner. Final notes, I want to say a few things about Global Geographic Information Management Initiative, because I know some of you are involved, and I expect some questions to come on that. So in anticipation of those, I'd like to say a few things about it. Actually, yesterday, Professor Salvemini talked about this. It was introduced, the Global Geographic Information Management Initiative was introduced at the regional cartographic conferences that the UN holds at regular intervals. It seeks to establish a high-level UN committee to address geographic information management coordination among all UN members at the global level. And actually, I think South Korea has said we will host the global meeting in 2011 when the Committee of Experts on GGIM are going to get together. This initiative is spearheaded, actually coordinated by the UN Statistical Division and the UN Cartographic Section. Now, those are both UN Secretariat entities, exactly like the organization that I am part of, the Assistant Secretary General's Office. At the moment, the two initiatives are disjointed. And the reason for that is being presented essentially as UNSTI looks introverted to the UN doing business, and GGIM is outside member states. Now, this is a very controversial statement, and it's both controversial within and outside the UN. It's controversial within the UN because it has led to certain practices that is just not untenable. And outside the UN, as a matter of fact, at the February meeting in New York, it was explicitly stated by one of the representatives of the member states, the Canadian representative, saying that based on their experience, that distinction is quite artificial. And there has to be a way of making the UN work very much in tandem, be interoperable with the way that the member states organize themselves internationally. And we're looking into that. There is, looking forward, 3 significant things happening now that's going to give the next push to UNSDI. For one thing, the urgency to address data sharing issues is becoming very, very hot within UN and also with the outside partners. I mean, there's, of course, the ESRIs and the Googles who want UN data, but then there are UN organizations who want each other's data, and at the moment, the situation is quite unclear, and the policies are leave much to be desired. How much time do you have? A good example, like we just lived through last week, an entity, a European entity out of Reading, UK, works very closely with the World Meteorological Organization. And they have need for UN-sanctioned international boundary data sets. Well, the cartographic section produces this data. But it has put a condition in the license saying that this data can only be used by UN agencies. So WMO can't give this data to its very close partner. So this goes against the grain of a UNSDI. And our response to it, of course, is that we're very sorry this is the way it is at the moment, but this particular fragmented implementation has to change, and it will when UNSDI is fully implemented. Another thing that's going to happen very soon is November 2010. Currently, it stands as Beirut, Lebanon. We're going to have the next plenary. Anjuik now is going to clarify its position on UNSDI. It's been a bit dormant over the last few months. And the significant thing that's going to happen there is we will now have 2 new co-chairs. 2 new UN organizations are going to lead Anjuik. That leadership is very, very important, especially at this very early stages of this initiative. And we're hoping that they will be much more amenable to the UNSDI development as it's been formulated up until now, and necessarily give the mandate, so to speak, to the organization that's willing to take this on, which is the office that I'm with, to move this forward. And one other thing that's happening that's quite obvious and has implications is that the UN Secretariat, which all these key UN organizations are part of, are looking internally in its existing internal ICT practices. And geographic information related mandates are also within this assessment. And as a matter of fact, next week there will be a report. My boss, the Assistant Secretary General, is going to present for the consideration of the General Assembly. That talks about the restructuring of the Secretariat in terms of its ICT practices, which also identifies a series of positions and roles for geospatial information professionals. At the moment, there are 173 different ICT posts within the Secretariat all around the world, and only 3 of them are geospatial specialists. And of course, things have changed very dramatically. There's a much larger spectrum of roles, and we're putting in place a career path for geospatial professionals. That's quite significant. Another thing, for instance, is that at the moment, the cartographic section, which has the largest group of GIS professionals within the UN, close to 200, over 200, supports peacekeeping operations around the world, has a mandate that only limits it to clearing cartographic products. Dates back to 1953. And of course, things have changed dramatically since then, and we're looking into improving it to give them more flexibility to do the things that are very much in line with what the requirements are of today. I'd like to close with this quote, and from where I am now with the Assistant Secretary General's office and where UNSDI is, this statement can't be more true. What's really about is coordination of organizational behavior. And there's some serious pain points that we're fully aware of, and we're working on those, and I'm quite hopeful that they will be overcome because the commitment is there at the higher levels of the UN for us to move forward and work much more closely with the existing initiatives around the world, one of them being Inspire. Thank you very much.